We will get started now. Thank you all for those who are here in person, for those who are online. I have to stand kind of off. I don't know if you can, yeah, I have to stand kind of here because of where the projector is, so bear with me. So today we're going to talk a little bit about taking action, specifically towards educational change. And I know this word might mean a lot of different things to folks in the room and listening online. So I think it's important to start off by telling you a little bit about the lenses through which I come to this work, because you're going to see a lot of evidence of that, like breadcrumbs throughout the conversation. So first, a little bit about who I am. So I come to engineering education with a background in aerospace and systems engineering. So I started thinking about what's going on in the classroom when I was an aerospace undergraduate student and noticing things around group dynamics, also the way courses were designed. And I was a teaching assistant trying to create experiences for my students to help them better understand really difficult concepts. When I was a master's student in systems engineering, I was formally introduced to engineering ed as a research field. I attended my first American Society for Engineering Ed conference, and kind of the rest is history. I'd found my people, I'd found my community. I knew there was a way to have some impact in my home field of aerospace, but also more broadly on the student experience. So since then, I have done a lot of work really thinking of bringing together the systems perspective and some work in human factors into engineering education. And you'll see that in the way I approach both the research methods and also the interpretation of my results. But I've also had the opportunity to collaborate with some incredible people. And so I've got to give a shout out to my research team. So my research group, REDES, began when I was a faculty member at Olin College of Engineering, which is located a little bit outside of Boston. And those students really helped kick off the group, which has continued since I transitioned to Florida International University in 2018. And our group has really grown from there. Across the students in the group and our scholars in the group, we focus a lot on the structures and transition points within the engineering education system and the people, and really try to understand how we can empower and change and redesign some of the things that are already there by understanding them more thoroughly. So with that in mind, the work today is going to focus on a particular group of people and a particular set of structures. And so I want to first ask this question of why study faculty. So while many of my students and team members, they focus on the student experience, a lot of my work focuses on the faculty experience, and even more recently looking at some administrative roles. So why study faculty? So my approach to it really seeks to complement work that's already been done in the educational change space. So things focused on different pedagogical models, the way we design and use classroom settings, things focused on change strategies, both individual and group and organizational. But my work brings in that, like the next part, which is focusing on faculty as people. I find faculty very interesting. I am one, but all of the rest also very interesting because of the complexity of the academic environment. So we have faculty. Faculty interact with students. Those of us who do work and research and think about how to support students know that this dynamic is already super complex. But let's add more complexity. Faculty also interact with their colleagues in their departments. They're thinking about how are we going to design the curriculum? How are we going to have resources be distributed in a department? How do I interact with my colleagues? What could I learn from them or not? But then faculty are also part of a college and a university. So now they're being impacted by resource allocation there, things related to promotion and tenure, there's professional development opportunities. Their environment gets more and more complex, as does their experience. They might have a very supportive department, but that might not be the case at the college or the reverse. There's also generally more broadly society, things going on locally and nationally. But the other piece that I found interesting within the work that I've been doing, and isn't the focus today, but is around disciplinary field. So their philosophies of teaching, how they consider and approach their research and mentorship, all of that, a lot of it is influenced by the field that they're in. So when we look at this and we try to start, and for me, I get excited of like understanding faculty as people means recognizing the complexities of the environment they're in and how that might impact their work. So you're going to see some of like my excitement around the complexity piece and the people piece as we go, but this is sort of my approach, and other folks look at faculty from different perspectives. So this leads to the question of today. So how might we empower and enable faculty to engage in educational change at their institutions? And I want to go ahead and say the caveat. If your work does not focus on faculty, you can fill in the blank, but you're going to play with me with faculty for a little while, and then we'll come back at the end and ask it for the stakeholder group that you most care about. So again, how might we empower and enable faculty to engage in educational change at their institutions? So let's break this down. I use the word change here, but I'm going to use it differently in this talk. So I want you to think in your mind differently than you might have expected. So oftentimes in engineering ed, we think of educational change, and really the connotation that happens is like moving towards more active learning. That's sort of this like high up, like, oh, this has been what we've talked about for a long time. Now there's some broader change discussions happening, especially in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space. So when we talk about educational change, it might be in that space. But the part that I want to focus on today, and the definition I want us to think about and have you play with me, is this idea of desired impact area. So I don't want to limit it. It can be those things I just talked about, but it can also be other things. Okay, let's generate some of those others. So what I'm going to ask you to do before I show you the question throughout today is, if you have paper, please use it. If you're on your computer, please use that. If you have neither, you can use your phone. But I want you to commit to the reflection question that I'm asking. So in whatever form you can commit to it. And so that's kind of why having notes or having your phone somewhere where you can write it down is helpful. So for your first question, I want to ask, what areas do you want to impact in your work? We're only going to take about 30 seconds for this. So think of the areas that, what is educational change for you, right? Okay, so you can keep writing, keep making notes. You can add to it as we go. You're thinking about those areas that you want to impact. So now let's keep breaking down this question. So the next set of terms I want to think about is this idea of to engage. So there is a lot of work out there that talks about faculty engagement, but it's typically talking about faculty engagement with something. And I want to have us think about engagement a little differently. So when I talk about engage, I'm talking about taking intentional and strategic action towards. So oftentimes, especially when I think about like student engagement, it's like, are they participating? But I'm typically asking them to do something when I'm talking about their engagement. Similar to faculty engagement with a new pedagogical model, they might be asked to do it. But I want to have it be from the faculty to take an intentional or strategic actions toward their desired impact area, okay? So with that definition in mind, and we're going to go into it more, I want to ask another question. What actions have you already taken towards your desired impact area? And as an example, it doesn't have to be a research project. For the doctoral students in the room, it could be enrolling in a doctoral program where I get to do engineering ed research, right? That is still an action towards your impact. So jot down a couple of actions. I think you all could spend a lot more time on all of these questions, but we don't have 2-3 hours, so I'm making it short. But I want to ask for the folks in the room, how many of you, as you were thinking of your actions that you've already taken, were you also evaluating those actions? Were you thinking, well, that one didn't work, well, that one worked, that one might work? Who was doing some evaluation as they were thinking of their actions a little bit? Okay, just remember that for later, okay? All right. So we have our question. We talked about what we mean by change for today, desired impact area, and this idea of taking intentional and strategic action. And I want to start to transition us into another term that we're going to talk about and define before we jump into the fun stuff. So today I'm going to talk about two different studies. I'm going to use two studies to talk about our overall topic today that have been focused on this idea of agency towards educational change. So the first study was a group of engineering education faculty trying to understand our own agency as we're trying to have impact. And then the second study, where a lot of our examples are going to come from, is really focused on individuals who are in predominantly teaching roles as faculty, and especially those individuals at Hispanic serving institutions. So big shout out to the collaborators, because without them, the discussion today would not be possible. But we'll jump into more of those on the project shortly. But as I said, I'm introducing this new term, this idea of agency. And again, similar to the other terms, change, engagement, it's defined differently across many different research areas. And some of you might know about the work on student agency. But I want to give you the definition we're going to work with today. So we are looking at this definition that comes from the faculty space of taking intentional and strategic actions or perspectives towards goals that matter to you. So the framing of this definition has two important things, two things to pay attention to. So the first is the word toward. So typically agency with this definition is always agency towards something, and the fact that it's goals that matter to you. So as an example, this could be a faculty member deciding to take action towards redesigning their course because they want to better support student learning. Students are struggling with these topics. I really want to rethink this class. So that's the action they're taking and the goal that matters to them. But at the same time, this could also be something where a faculty member is advocating for promotion criteria. And so in the case of these instructional faculty, where they have a promotion criteria, but they're not on the tenure track, they want to see those well-defined because it impacts their ability to interact with students, to do professional development, engage in other areas, and they see this goal as important. So these are just some examples of how we might think about and use agency. Now, the last definition I want to share with you, and then we get to jump into how it all relates to each other, is something that came up in our work, and you'll see it in the title of how I talk about some of the results. And it's this idea of professional agency. So this comes from work focused on teacher reform. So teachers were trying to engage in different educational reform efforts at their institutions. And the researchers started to see this idea of agency being a little broader and focusing on exerting influence, making choices, and taking stances. So it can be, action doesn't always have to be like I'm physically doing something, it can be internal as well. And those actions affect their work as well as can affect their professional identities. So you'll see some of this come up as we go forward. I just wanted to put this definition up there, okay? All right. Now, an example. So I've given you all these definitions. How is it actually coming to life when we're talking about faculty engaging in educational change? So this is from the study of engineering instructional faculty. It's a story of a faculty member who we're going to call Lady. So she came to become an instructional faculty because first she fell in love with engineering and then decided to go back to her PhD and fell in love with teaching. And so she really wants to be the person that can support students who also love engineering, who want to pursue the dream of being an engineer or other dreams as well. She is currently an instructional faculty member at a 4-year private emerging Hispanic serving institution. She has a lot of departmental support. This came up over and over again in our interactions with her about how much the department supports her, but she's still in a role that is generally unsupported by the university, being on a non-tenure track instructional position. So for Lady, she was teaching a foundational course that was really a gateway or threshold course, as some institutions call them. And she had been trying to figure out what students were struggling with. And finally, it dawned on her. And she goes, I'm really noticing them struggling visualizing concepts. So this was sort of the event or incident that led to what she was going to do next. So she thought of a bunch of different options. And she thought that maybe augmented reality would be beneficial to the students. Maybe a chance to interact with the concepts in the course would really change their level of understanding. And the more she thought about it, she was like, wait a second, our communications department, they teach gaming design. Maybe they would be willing to help me with this. So she took an action, and they had no interest in working with her. Kind of like, no, this really isn't something we do. And as she thought about it and talked about it in our interview with her, she said, I kind of gave up on that dream. I'm not gonna, yes, they're struggling with this. This is my idea, but they don't want to work with me. What's interesting is that that dream, this action, this story of her agency, kind of came around again because 2 years went by before she decided to pursue the idea. Yet, leaving on a high note of her story, this time when she pursued it, she was more prepared and successful, and actually has received some funding to look at this work. So we'll come back to her story, but I wanted to give you an example of someone with a goal in mind, supporting her students visualizing concepts, taking actions, and how that all played out. All right, so now we have an example to kind of ground all of the fun theory that I'm going to go into next. Are we ready? Okay. All right, so I mentioned 2 projects. So this is the first project. This NSF project started back in 2015 to support agency among early career engineering ed faculty. The 6 of us were just starting engineering ed faculty positions, and we wanted to have an impact. But we were early career. And we were told, don't redesign your classes till post-tenure, or we were starting as instructional faculty with no promotion criteria, or we were starting in brand new engineering ed programs going, what is about to happen here? We felt a little lost, and we wanted to better understand how we could achieve this impact. And we decided to do a research project around it and study our own experiences. So over the course of many years, I think 4 years of data collection overall, we were 6 early career engineering ed faculty qualitatively studying our experiences transitioning into these roles. So some of you had a chance to read a paper from Studies in Engineering Ed focused on that transition. This work includes not only that, but even more data. So to start this process, there was really a question of how do we study ourselves, but also how do we recognize that we are actively trying to pursue impact. So this is the part where I could give an entire 45-minute talk just on the methods. So I'm going to warn you, I'm just going to give you the high-level touch points, and I'm happy to talk about this more after. Okay. All right. So first, we found this method, collaborative inquiry. And this would allow us to really think about how we are actively in the moment pursuing our impact, reflect on it, collaboratively make sense of it, and move forward from there. But this wasn't enough. Like when we talked about it, we were like, something's missing here. Because if we study this, our experiences, we're also trying to understand the academic culture that we're part of. We're in these different institutions, we're in these different positions, what is going on in the culture. So we brought in another method called collaborative autoethnography, which really allowed us to understand those features of the culture that are influencing our agency. And to make things really fun, when we started analyzing this data, we realized that we needed a little bit more structure around it, and we brought in constructivist grounded theory. I'm sure you all can read that because of the transcript, but it says constructivist grounded theory. And so here we were trying to co-construct this data set and ultimately develop some contextualized theory of agency from it. So again, I could have long conversations about this, just giving you the high level, because I want to get into the results. Okay, so we used lots of methods to longitudinally look at our experiences. And what came out of that was moving away from originally what was in the research around faculty agency, which I'm going to show you briefly, into this new contextualized theory of professional agency towards impact. So we started from faculty agency. For those of you interested in studying faculty, this is a great framework to look at, but it was really focused only on faculty at research-intensive institutions who were in tenure-track research positions. And given that we were in a lot of different institutional contexts, a lot of us were really focused on what are, we're creating new departments and new programs, which was a little different from the faculty they looked at in this study. So we started here with this existing framework. And we ended with this theory of professional agency. And I don't know if I have mouse. I can get rid of this for folks in the room. Okay, so the framework I'm going to break down for you. It starts with influences, very similar to the framework by Campbell and O'Meara. And each of these influences, we began with sort of thinking about the obvious ones that we were noticing coming up right away in our data. So the first is this idea of self. So self is really focused on, give me 1 second, now I'm not in the PowerPoint. All right, self is really focused on who we are as person. Because we come into our roles, we come into the classroom with our prior experiences, our cultural and educational backgrounds, our predispositions. Are we excited about something? Our perspectives of, for instance, for faculty of the tenure track. So one example of like, I remember when I was applying for my first positions, I was going, I don't want to be a tenure track research faculty member. You know, I've seen at my PhD institution, that's not something I want to do. I want to focus on teaching. That was a perspective. That was who I was, that was going to be influencing how I really tried to perceive impact in my role and try to achieve it. This is an example from one of the faculty. I'm going to be, by the way, using pseudonyms throughout. And in our group, we had a mixed gender group, but predominantly women. So we ended up using all feminine pseudonyms to make sure we were maintaining confidentiality. So all feminine pseudonyms. So this quote, trying to learn new things and learning from others, was something that Avery was really reflecting on what she was excited about. And so this really going into her role was telling us a little bit about things she cared about, as well as things she was going to be looking to, like looking forward to or looking out for. So this was who she was, self. The other thing that I think for most of us, we can agree can influence our agency and the actions that we're taking is our situation. And so in this example, Riley is talking about getting some challenges she's expecting around getting to know people in her department, the way the structure of the department was set up, and also her responsibilities around designing new courses and curriculum, while also trying to do her research and trying to make sense of all of that. So within our situation, we think about these things. What institution are we at? You know, what is the position that everyone expects of me? So if you're in a tenure track role, you're expected to do research. If you're in a teaching role, you're expected to teach. But what if you also want to do research? So there's the situation, what are the expectations? And then there's yourself, right? And so we'll get to the middle next. But situation also captures things in society, things in our field that are happening as well. And then the last part of the influence was sort of this thing that we couldn't untangle. We kept trying. We'll have self, we'll have situation. But there kept being this moment of, well, if I had started, so I just shared with you all, like originally I didn't want to pursue a tenure track research position. I pursued a predominantly teaching position. If I had come right out of graduate school and I had gone into a tenure track role, I'm still myself, but the situation is different. And so who I am in that new situation is different. And that's what we couldn't untangle. So the example here is Nova describing how she ended up getting not only a faculty position, but one as an assistant director at her institution of a center. And this was partially because of what she wanted to help students through her research and what she was thinking about in positions. So you can imagine if Nova had gone into just a tenure track research position, who she is in that role might have been different. And so this situational self allowed us to capture things like our own awareness of our situation, our own, how our perspectives are manifesting, like our interpretation of things that are happening because we are where we are and who we're becoming in that role. So organizational commitment is something that came up here, and how tied we were to the organization really was kind of sitting in this middle ground. So if we talked about like taking actions previously towards our desired impact areas, we recognized in our work that there were definitely many things influencing that agency. So at this point, I want to ask some questions. So again, I'm going to ask you to write these down. I'm going to share the questions with you and then have you do them just for about like 45 seconds. I want you to think about your own influences. Could not come up with one overarching question, so bear with this one's wordiness, but how might you describe aspects of your general self, like who, a little bit of who are you that's important to your pursuing impact. I also want you to think about your situation, where you are now, what position you're in, what's going on in your institution, discipline, state, in your world that could influence your agency. And then also, how might you define who you are, your role in broader context? If you get to one of these, great. If you get to two of them, great. But just take a second and think about some of your own influences. Like another 15 seconds. I know it's not long enough, but we just want to start thinking in this space. All right. So professional agency, if it starts with influences, the next thing is the actual agency part. And so we call this part the agentic process, but it's this idea of really connecting to taking action. One of the things that we found, and it emerged, and I'll just tell you from a research perspective, it's one of those results you get really excited about because it's not going away. Like no matter how many times you're like, well, maybe this really isn't what's going on. Maybe this is nuanced. Maybe not. I'm not sure. Like, should this really be a finding? But it wouldn't go away from our data. And it was this idea of strategic perspective, which came from the agency literature, but in particular that thought bubble, and what we came to call available moves. So what we were seeing is something happens. Your students are struggling to visualize concepts in your class. You are going to take a strategic perspective. You're going to think of and generate all the possible available moves that you can take in that moment. Now, just yes, the available moves I'm going to think of are not the same that you're going to think of. That's where this got super interesting, because now we're seeing that someone's actions that they're taking are being influenced by the available moves they are generating. And so the other part that was so intertwined that we could not pull it out was this idea of professional capital. Who you know and who you interact with also changes the available moves you consider. So for instance, I might be like, okay, Erin, help me, I'm struggling in my class. Can you help me think of how these students are not visualizing these concepts? But if I didn't have that connection and that knowledge that he might have an answer that I needed, then I'm not going to have thought of that as an available move. And so once you're in that strategic perspective, you're generating those available moves, then you're evaluating them. And this is where your influences are also coming into play. Well, I had a prior experience where I tried to do an active learning thing in my class and the students really didn't like it and it showed up on my evaluations, so I can't do that. That's just not an option for me. So even though you generate an available move, your evaluation is impacted by the perspectives of people in your department on whether or not that type of active learning strategy is like, oh, that's okay for us to do, or you're impacted by your own roles and responsibilities or your prior experiences. And so all of that is tied into really this decision of what action or no action to take. Okay? So let's play with that. This is the fun part. So I'm going to have you take 30 seconds to a minute to reflect on a scenario or challenge you've faced or are facing in attempting to achieve your impact. And then I want you to record all of your possible available moves. And I'll give everyone a full minute on this one. Just like 30 more seconds. All right, so now, and this is mostly for my folks in the room, my folks on Zoom, I'm gonna have you, this is your homework to do this part of the activity. So what I want the folks in the room to do is pair up and quickly share just your scenario and say nothing as your partner generates other available moves for you. Okay, so find someone or do it. You can do a quick group of 3. I think we might have. Yeah, I think we have an even number. So if everyone could find a partner, super quick, and you're going to share your scenario and then generate some available moves.
Right.
What's your impact you are looking to?
My scenario is getting a student. So on my mind,
Okay.
but that was a
And,
challenge to achieving impact.
okay. So, and now I'm supposed to tell you, you don't tell me your moves. I'm just gonna start telling you moves.
Yes,
Even though this is something you and I.
I can pick a new challenge. I can pick a new challenge.
No, it's okay, it's okay. I was just teasing you. Recruiting from College of Education, co-advising, postdoc researcher, which could be co-advised. Recruiting from existing students that might not have found an advisor in the College of Engineering or in the College of Ed. Hiring a remote postdoc or part-time postdoc that's shared with other people. That's something I've seen people do.
All right, so we need more time. We need more time, but here we are. So we're going to switch and have the other person go.
Did you get to tell me what your things were?
I can. There were none of those. It was like give up and no. Oh. All right. What is your challenge?
Well, maybe I did the activity wrong,
Oh.
but it was like the impact. I was like, okay, I want to impact like wellness and mental health culture in higher education.
Okay.
I think I
No,
went
yeah.
too big.
Is there like a challenge to doing that? Or does that?
Impact goal, you can also come up with available moves. So
Okay. Okay. So all right. So influencing, having an impact, how you can do
Like
that.
how to like shift the culture. Yeah. That was
Yeah.
the one I wrote down.
Okay. You can collect evidence and try to convince people that this is important. You can organize students to complain and
Yeah.
as a group, right, make sure it's clear that they think this is important. You can just do small things in the classes that you teach with the students you have, and then find the people, the early adopters, the people who want to do it. Something you did, right, a guest editorial for SEE. But you can do that for like disciplinary publications, like a biomedical something, or like Prism, so like academic journals.
Right.
I think
Okay.
just
so
normalizing and just
this
talking
was
about
a
the
start
importance.
to more conversation and thinking, but I heard at least people coming up with 1 or 2 moves that the other person could do. That's a success. So I'll have you go back to your seats in a second, but how I want you thinking about this as you leave the talk today are things like, how do my own experiences impact what I see as available? How can our professional capital support our ability to exercise agency? So this is definitely something that we're trying to kind of isolate through a simple activity like this, and you can do it over coffee and make it longer, of like how we are shaping what we see as an option, and how connecting with other people and people in our network can really support what we see as possible, as well as like not only what, but how we're evaluating it.
Mhm.
So if at some points they gave you a suggestion, you're like, you are evaluating it, but they can also help you reevaluate that, okay? All right, so I want to share with you the end of kind of where this framework is in a short example, since we have a few minutes left. So with this in mind, what happens now? You take the action. And so there's what we call in our outcome space, there's first an output. And as philosophical as this might sound, we might never know what the true output of our actions are or our inaction. We can like go on a long discussion about this, but we really might never know. There's direct and indirect effects onwards. That's the output. But the 2 important pieces are this impact perspective and feedback. So our impact perspective is how we are making sense of the impact of what we did. So for example, if in my class, I make a change to how I teach one of my lessons and I see two students, like I'm making actually, let me rephrase. So for a particular reason. So if I have a personality that people say, you have like very high standards of your own work, right? That's kind of my impact perspective is I'm going to sit here at the end of this presentation and I'm going to say, oh, that didn't go so well. Irregardless, I am evaluating my own understanding of what action I took. But then there's also feedback that's interacting with that. So this is the example in the class of like, well, two students fell asleep in the back, that's feedback. Or I was speaking really fast because I'm tired because I stayed up all night to prepare the material and my body is giving me feedback. And that's interacting with the impact perspective. So what we really saw was this feedback and impact perspective. Our agency is truly cyclical in a sense. It is affecting now who we are. So if my body is really tired, it's affecting where I am right now. I could get sick and so on. It's affecting our situation, maybe now in the classroom and what my students are expecting from me, and as well as the available moves I'm going to consider in the future. So all of this kind of evaluation of now the action is impacting what I'm going to do later. And we saw this over and over again in our data is that the impact of our work, like the impact we wanted to have and then the impact it had and the feedback we received from other people was so central as opposed to the actual actions. So agency, that definition I shared with you, is about taking actions, but what we really saw is it's all, what are you trying to take an action toward? Like, where are you trying to go? And what impact is it having and are you trying to have? And we also saw this as very temporal. So how I would approach a challenge in my class about students struggling with a visual concept, my first year as a faculty member is very different from how I would do it now because of all of these things that are cycling. So we won't have time for this, but another time. Think of a time where outcomes of one of your actions affected yourself or your situation or your future available moves. It gets really interesting to do this reflection. So to go back to Lady's story I shared with you all earlier, we were able to see with data from another study, this study focused on engineering instructional faculty, how Lady's influences, who she was, impacted how she approached the initial, my students are struggling with this concept, how she evaluated her available moves at different times. And her story is really interesting because she also used demos in her class. She tried all these other things, and you got to watch the cycle of her agency happen as she was telling this story. And then the outcomes, how this group had no interest in working with her and how it delayed her to pursue the idea, but at the same time also prepared her more to do it again. She had a better sense of what the argument she would need to make was. So it had lots of impacts on her agency. So we've really enjoyed having like this contextualized theory. It just was published in Journal of Engineering Ed this January, but I have been really appreciating having the language of it to support some of the faculty development research I do. And so I want to close by coming back to this idea of now thinking about how might we empower and enable faculty, and share just one final example from this study. So this is the other study I introduced at the beginning, focused on engineering instructional faculty at Hispanic serving institutions. This dial here, I won't go into all the details, but is the example of an action research cycle. So what we did on this project, which has an amazing team, by the way, we started by trying to understand the experiences and perspectives of engineering instructional faculty. That's the plan phase. And then we designed a professional development opportunity for them based on what we learned in this multiple case study that we did. And so what I'm going to share with you now is one of the findings that came out of looking at the agency of these instructional faculty toward educational change and how we actually then use that in the design of our professional development, thinking about how to empower and enable these faculty. So I'm going to share with you a little bit about Jane. We had a lot of fun learning from Jane. So Jane was at a 2-year public institution, and I'm going to read the quote for you now. So she says, So to me, higher education should be open door. Anyone should be able to come in. It should be low cost, small classrooms. I had my first semester, one of our students, and they were on FAST, which should be capitalized, financial aid, and everything else. And they came up and told me that they had spent almost $2,000 on textbooks, more than their tuition. And I just about flipped out. So I said, that's it, that's it. We're using pre-open source material online. This is ridiculous. And we try and keep tuition low, right? Which means that it's a limited budget, especially with COVID. It's even more limited. But I found out that using recycled materials, let's just call it that way, it's actually less intimidating. When I was at previous institution, I taught a materials testing lab, and we had these huge hydraulic machines in LabVIEW at Steel, and it was an intense lab. And I create stress strain diagrams for our students too, but we don't do it with a hydraulic press. We do it with a rubber band, and we load it by filling up a water bottle, and there's paper clips involved and straight, but it's not intimidating. So what we found from Jane and many of our other engineering instructional faculty is that agency for them was a little bit of adaptation. They were very well versed in shifting their change strategies to support student learning and the student experience in their courses. And this might sound like a very, like to me, even when we wrote it, it was like, oh, this feels very obvious, but to not say it would be to take away some of the really awesome work that these instructional faculty were doing. Because even in institutions where they were low resourced, or even in departments where they weren't supported, we were seeing them make these adjustments to keep trying to support their students. They were cycling through those actions. Okay, we're getting feedback from the chair that he can't support this because there's not enough money in the budget this year. I'm gonna try this now. Or I'm noticing that the students don't have, they're paying all this money on textbooks. I'm gonna just change it and do something in my class that's different. And they just kept making these adjustments. So if these are the faculty that we're trying to amplify their awesome contributions, and we're trying to support them being leaders of educational change, what do we do? So we designed an institute that ran its first, the whole institute ran this past fall, and we'll run it again next fall, that had three main components: a kickoff, in-person workshop, virtual coaching, and a celebration at the end. And here we kind of see some of the topics: leveraging assets, scoping and action planning, assessing success, etc. But what I wanted to show you is just two particular examples of that result showing up in our design. So one of the things we recognized is that we needed to recognize what they had already done so that they could learn from each other. Because if they had been adapting and using all these different change strategies, i.e. all these different available moves, they could generate a really long list for other people. And they could also support other people finding really successful resources, also learning about what they needed to do something, because they had had all this experience. So we needed to celebrate and leverage that. So one of the activities we had them do in person was to generate the assets that they have at their institution. And that conversation was magical, because you'd watch people at two-year colleges standing there with well-resourced private four-year institutions, and the folks at two-year colleges had assets that the four-year folks didn't even know it existed on their campus because they had different situations. And so you hear all these resources that we weren't expecting that people weren't expecting to hear come out in the discussion. And then the other part was those needs, like, oh, if you're gonna try this, you should get this. Their expertise, which was really becoming central and moving away from the facilitator as expert. The other way we did this is we used something called group coaching, which is a tool. It's used in some forms of like leadership development. It's used in writing. I know there's a lot of like writing group coaching and other topics as well. But we really used it as a way to have them learn from and with each other. So the facilitator, the coach, is not the expert. They ask questions, the people in the group interact with each other. And so they would, about halfway through the 6 sessions, these individuals would start asking questions themselves. So they were taking over the coach role. They were like, well, tell me more about why you decided to do that. Who else on your campus could help you with this? And so again, all their expertise from their change strategies that they tried was coming out in these discussions, both how they answered and how they asked. And so that was something that for us was really allowing us to see how looking at their agency was allowing us to then design something that could empower and enable them to further engage in educational change. And so I'll leave you with today, how might this theory and these terms and constructs I talked about help you answer questions in your own work and for your own stakeholders? And I know I ran long, so thank you, and I am around for questions though. Yes.
So I saw, when you were showing the schedule for the Amplify, session, you had a celebration at the end. I think that's cool. I'm just curious, like, what do you do there? Sort of, I don't want to say ulterior motive, but is there something else that?
So a lot of it's around closure. So one of the things we also saw is when we've run workshops in the past, there's sort of this idea of folks come to the workshop and then they leave. And so we wanted them to have a way to reconnect to one another, but also like recognize all the work they've done. So those were our ulterior motives. It was also a way for them to re-interact with each other because they started as a big group and then they were split into coaching groups. And so this allowed them to come back. But there will be more, we have more things planned because the Institute is it's going to become self-sustaining. So the facilitators from this, we're going to have folks from this become facilitators in the next one. And we're going to be doing things that build off of it in the future. Yeah. Other questions in the room? I know there's a couple in the Q&A. I don't know if you, well, I guess I could do it here and let folks see it. But is there any other? Oh, we're still on. Thank you. Okay. No open questions there. Any other questions in the room or on Zoom? All right. I asked you all a lot. Think about a lot. Any observations that you all had in kind of thinking about all these topics? Yeah.
So, I mean, I have so many things that I'm trying to articulate, but you talked about two different, but sort of related projects. Can you tell us a little bit more about how, like the second one about the engineering instructional faculty maybe informed what you were doing with your first project or vice versa?
So the first project I would say really came into the engineering instructional faculty project like very intensely, because what happened when we originally put in the proposal for it's through the Hispanic Serving Institution program. When we originally put in the Amplify project proposal, we had planned to use teachers as leaders, engineering leadership, and design thinking as like main theoretical frameworks. But then coming out of the first project and starting to put together this contextualized theory, I was like, these frameworks that we were going to use are not telling the full story. Like I felt it was just missing this connection between who they are and their backgrounds and things that they had tried, because in faculty development regularly, I feel like for me, I hear people say, well, I've tried that and it doesn't work. And I'm like, well, tell me there's more to that. And so in our initial interviews, we got some really interesting stories. Specifically, the one from Lady sort of stuck out for me as, well, this is an example of exactly what we're writing up in this other paper on our contextualized theory. What if we brought it to this data set? And so agency has actually become really central in the second project, even though originally in the proposal it was not, just because we started to see things over and over again. Yeah. And the other thing I will mention that was kind of really nice. So we did create the theory focused on engineering ed faculty, but those engineering ed faculty included instructional faculty and included faculty at Hispanic Serving Institutions. And so it was like this nice, so we're now not using a theory that's totally kind of foreign to the space. We're bringing it in, having been built on multiple different institutional contexts. So it's held up pretty well so far. Any other thoughts, reflections, things you don't like or disagree with? I'm also open to improving. Iterating is important.
Thank you so much. There are snacks to go out there, and I want to, from